back. It's been a while since I've done an editing episode, so in today's video I'm going to show you my editing process and also how you can get that cinematic look. Now, I know what you're thinking, cinematic, this term has been thrown around all over the place and can pretty much mean anything, and to be honest, it's completely subjective. It really can mean anything because there's no clear example of what cinematic is. Now, for me, when I say cinematic, I'm just referring to photos which look like they could be lifted out of a film. Also, it's worth noting, there are a couple of components when it comes to taking cinematic photos. It's not all in the edit, but these are things I'll get into on a later episode. For today, I'm strictly looking at the editing process and helping you get that cinematic look through editing. If you find this episode helpful, please drop a thumbs up on it and remember to subscribe too. But with that out of the way, let's hop over to Lightroom and start editing. Okay, so we are over in Adobe Lightroom, and for today's episode, I'm going to be editing a couple photos which I took in Japan earlier this year. Now, before getting started, I've released a new preset pack called Cinefilm. There's 6 presets in the pack, and these are the presets I use to start all of my edits. Now, by no means do you need presets to edit, and you don't need this preset pack. However, in my case, I find that 1, it saves me time, and 2, it allows me to keep a more consistent look when it comes to editing my photos. As I said, the link to this is in the description down below. So for this episode, I'll edit the first one from scratch, and then afterwards, I'll show you how I use my presets to also edit, as that's a bit closer to my day-to-day editing workflow. So the first thing I do when it comes to editing is set the white balance, and I'm not using this to creatively add some warm tones or cool tones or bring some purples or greens into my image. At this point, it's all about correcting the image to make it look like the scene I saw with my eye. Now, sometimes your camera or the automatic white balance tool on Lightroom will change the scene depending on the colors and the tones in the image. For example, if you take a photo during sunset and there's lots of warm tones, your camera will often try to correct it and make it a bit more neutral. Whereas in real life, the scene was actually really warm. So when it comes to this white balance tool, it's more about recreating the image you actually saw rather than adding any creative spin to it. Now in this case, I feel like the camera done a pretty good job at capturing the scene, and I don't really need to make any changes to it. Next up is basic adjustments. Now, first thing first is exposure and contrast. So for this image here, I'm going to bring the exposure up a bit to around 0.6, and when it comes to contrast, I always feel that the contrast slider on Lightroom adds too much contrast into areas of the photo I don't want there to be contrast. Now, what you have to remember about the basic adjustments, it's all based on algorithms in the background, so when you bring down the blacks, you're kind of relying on Lightroom to make the correct decision. I instead prefer using the tone curve to add in contrast and adjust the highlights in my image, but we're going to get to that shortly. Firstly, I'm just going to play around with some of these basic adjustments and get the photo to roughly around where I want it to be. So already, just with some basic adjustments, we've reduced the dynamic range, we brought out the subject a little more. Next up is texture, clarity, and dehaze. Now again, much like the basic adjustments, these are all based on algorithms in the background. Now my personal view is pretty much all digital cameras take photos way too sharp, and it's the reason why old film cameras are more pleasing on the eye, because the images they take are a bit softer. So when it comes to these settings, I like to turn down the texture, bring it down to like -25, and with clarity, let's bring it down to around -30. With dehaze, normally I'm leaving it on 0, or sometimes I go into the minus if I want to reduce the contrast. But generally speaking, I don't really use the dehaze unless it's actually a hazy scene. Next up, vibrance and saturation. With these ones, I like to start by bringing them down a few notches. For me, it gives me a bit more freedom when I get down to the HSL sliders. So here, I'm bringing down the vibrance, I'm bringing down the saturation slightly. So that's the first basic adjustments done. And as you can see, what's happened here is I've reduced the dynamic range in this image. It's a lot flatter, there isn't as much color, there isn't as much contrast, and this gives me more freedom when it comes to the tone curve and the HSL sliders to really add in the color and the contrast I want exactly where I want it. So next up, let's move on to the tone curve. Now this is probably the tool I use the most when it comes to my edits, and I can literally spend hours moving the tone curve around, getting the look exactly where I want it to be. To be honest, the more I learn about the tone curve, the better I got at editing. It's probably the most powerful editing tool there is in Lightroom, and the reason is it allows you to really pinpoint exactly which parts of the image you want to add brightness or darkness to, or which parts of the image you want to add more reds or greens or purples or warmer tones or cooler tones to. Whereas when you rely on the basic settings and the sliders like on the white balance, they make general changes to the image. So if I add purple into the white balance, the entire image is going purple. Whereas on the tone curve, if I add purple only into the shadows, and then I bring some greens in the midtones and greens into the highlights, then the shadow areas will be the only areas which have those purple tones. I really do recommend really spending time to master the tone curve and really get used to using it. Now, what I like to do is add 4 or 5 points to the tone curve. A quick tip while you're using this tool is to hold the Option key, as it allows you to make more precise movements on the curve, whereas when you don't use the Option key and you try to move it around, it's a bit too sensitive. So for this image here, I'm going to use this tone curve to add some contrast into the photo. And then I'm going to bring up the highlights slightly to give my tone curve a bit of an S-curve. Finally, I'm going to bring up the black slightly. When it comes to the tone curve, it's all about small little adjustments. You don't want to go crazy moving things around. So that looks about right just to start off with. Next up, what you can do is head in to the red, green and blue channels. Again, I'm adding control points on all of them, and then you can start making changes to the midtones or the shadows or the highlights, bringing in more blue tones if you want, or bring warmer tones in. Again, you can spend hours on the tone curve making these changes. So for this episode, I'm going to quickly go through, make a few changes to all of the channels, and then we can continue from there. Okay, so I've added a little bit more contrast into the image using the tone curve. I've also added some cooler purple tones to the shadows and warmer tones to the highlights. As you can see, the before the tone curve and after the tone curve. As I go through the edit, I'll constantly be making more changes to the tone curve as I go along, and at the very end of the edit, I'll probably go back to the tone curve again and make some minor adjustments. As I said, the tone curve, the most important tool when it comes to editing your photos. Highly recommend that you really get to grips and master this tool. Okay, so next up is the HSL tool. This is the hue, saturation and luminance. At this point, it's all about getting the colors to around where I want them to be. A lot of this is personal taste, and it's also one of these tools which can help you achieve a consistent look. For example, if in all of your photos your reds are pretty consistent, both the tone, the luminance and the saturation, that can help give you more of a consistent look. Try to develop your own style, your own consistent look with colors. As I said, that's going to help you create more consistent work in your photography. When it comes to the color grading tool, I find myself using this less and less as I've been using the tone curve more. So you can pretty much do what you do with the tone curve with the color grading, but it's just not as precise. As I said, it's not a tool I use too much since I've used the tone curve more and more, and when I do use it, I'm very light with the settings, so I normally don't go too far with the saturation. So that's the very basic edit done so far. So next up, I'm going to go through each of the tools again and start making some more edits. When it comes to editing, it's about making those minor adjustments, moving on to the next tool, making some more adjustments, and keep building and building and building until you get the image exactly where you want it to be. Next up, I'm going to add a little vignette to this image, and I'll also add some grain here too. Okay, so I got this edit to pretty much where I want it to be, and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. So the main changes we've done here is we've reduced the dynamic range, we've changed the colors, we brought some purple tones into the shadows and kept some warmer ones in the highlights. And overall, it's just helped give more of a cinematic look to this image compared to its original form. Alright, so next up, let's move over to this image here. And for this one, I'm actually going to use one of the presets from my pack. Now in my pack, there are 6 separate looks. Each of them are pretty different and pretty unique, and I use them depending on the scene. So first up, we have Neon. This one is my go-to preset, and it's the one I usually use when I'm starting an edit. It can be used for night scenes, day scenes, it's very versatile, and if I'm editing quickly, this will always be my starting point. Next, we've got Perfect Blue. This is a much cooler look. I really like the look of this at nighttime, and also on cloudy days I feel like it works really well. So it adds lots of blues into the shadows and generally is a more cooler looking preset. Next up, we've got Jet Black, and this is a black and white preset which I built over years of experience and just playing around with black and white looks. Next up, we have Tokyo Vice. Now this is an edit which is inspired by Japanese films and some animes. Next up, we have Paprika. This preset here is more of a warm film look. I really like using this on photos where the sun's out and my subjects are lit by natural light. I really feel like the warm tones come out really well. Finally, there's Sakura. Now this preset here, I normally use for more landscape scenes. So as you'll see on the screen right now, these images taken of Mount Fuji and the town around it, these were all edited using the Sakura preset. So that's the 6 presets in my pack. So for this photo here, I'm gonna go straight in with the Tokyo Vice preset. I really like the look it gives, it's pretty bold. I'm gonna use this as a starting point to edit. I'll quickly go through it so you can see the end result pretty quickly. Alright, so this photo is pretty much where I want it to be. This is the original and this is the edited version using the Tokyo Vice preset. Next up, let's head over to this image here taken in Shimbashi in Tokyo. For this one here, I'm going to use Perfect Blue and quickly edit this image. Alright, so this image is pretty much where I want it to be. Finally, this daytime scene here, I'm going to use the Paprika preset, quickly put that on there. It is pretty close to where I want it to be. I'll quickly make some minor adjustments to this one here. Alright, so that's the 4 photos I've edited for this episode. If you're going for that cinematic look, you're going to want to reduce the dynamic range, really take care of your shadows and your highlights, and be prepared to play around with the colors until you get them exactly where you want them to be. Alright, so I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Again, if you're interested in my presets, I have a link to those down below in the description. And if this episode did help you, please do drop a thumbs up on it, and if you haven't already, do remember to subscribe. If you have any questions about editing, drop those in the comments down below. I will get back to you. And finally, thank you for watching and for your support. Catch you in the next one.